Hi everyone! Today I want to talk about watercolor paper. I'm sure you've heard so many times that watercolor paper is very important. It can make a huge difference to your learning process, and it can make everything so much harder or so much easier for you. So today I want to share with you my absolute favorite watercolor paper for beginners. So before I start, I want to mention that I'm not sponsored by this brand. This is just my personal experience, and I just wanted to share it with you. I have been painting for years with watercolors, and I have tried all the main brands, the expensive ones, the cheaper ones. I have tried Saunders, I have tried cold press and rough surface Saunders. I have tried Arch, of course, the most popular watercolor paper. This is the hot press Arch, and cold press rough surface. I have tried Fabriano, I have tried Bauhang, and some of the other cheaper brands. I also tried Winsor & Newton artist quality watercolor paper. So before I tell you which one is my absolute favorite for my beginner students or any beginner watercolor artist, I'm going to talk a little bit about the quality of this different watercolor papers. So I'm going to start with Arch. So this is a very popular watercolor paper. I use this paper so many times in a lot of my paintings. The hot press watercolor paper is a very smooth watercolor paper. It's kind of hard to paint wet on wet with this paper because it doesn't stay wet for long at all. But if you're painting like a really simple sketchy style kind of a painting with a lot of wet on dry technique, so that you don't really have to blend and do a lot of wet on wet or softening edges at all. You just want to paint wet on dry. You want to glaze another layer on top of it, wet on dry. And maybe you would like to have some mixed media and maybe have some pastel pencils or like markers, color pencils, watercolor pencils. Those look absolutely amazing on this paper because of its smooth surface. Sometimes I really like to do mixed media art with a lot of like mark makings, texture effects, abstract shapes, and this paper is my absolute favorite, or really honestly any hot press paper, because they don't really they're not that different, to be honest. In my opinion, I have tried some cheaper ones like this sketchbook, and it's very cheap, but I think it's just as good as Arch hot press. I like to do like sketchbook, like abstract shapes and just a lot of mark makings. I love to use my pastel pencils and just maybe watercolor crayons. I have some of my favorite ones here that are really cool to use. And this kind of paper is very suitable for this way of painting, like mixed media way of painting. So I do not recommend you spend the money for Arch, which is kind of expensive. I think you can get the same quality with other papers. And you can also use some other techniques with this paper. For example, there are some pouring techniques. There's this abstract artist that I really admire, and he does abstracts in oils, but he likes to pour paint and just move it around and do like this and see if he can see any kind of patterns or anything that resembles a landscape painting. For example, if he has some blue paint over here, you could see it as water, or really anything that appears on the paper, and he believes that the truth of a painting is on a paper, it's not in your head. It's not the planning you do for a painting. So it's a completely different way of painting, but this is the right paper for it. There's also Arch cold press, which is the most popular one. Everybody uses it because it's easy to have some details, because the texture is not that harsh like the rough surface paper. The texture is just a little bit so that you can do wet on wet, and you can do blending edges. But I have to say that doing wet on wet and doing blending edges, it is harder on cold press than on rough surface. Rough surface has more of this tooth. It's just a lot more pronounced. This is cold pressed, and this is rough surface. You can see that these textures, the texture of the paper is really rough. So this stays wet much longer than this one because of all the paint and water seeps into it. So this stays wet for longer if you want to do like sky, clouds, or like paint something, soften the edges with a clean damp brush. This is much easier for beginners than this one, but it is kind of hard to create some thin lines, or if you would like to have like a clean edge for a house you're painting or anything. Because of all this texture, it is hard to have like a straight, nice, clean edge. Depending on what you're painting, sometimes when I'm painting something really loose, a lot of water is involved, and I'm trying to like paint a very atmospheric landscape painting, I usually use this rough surface paper. And sometimes when my landscape or any painting that I'm doing needs more definition, has more details, I use the cold press that is easier to, less textured. So I know that this is a very unpopular opinion. I hope I don't get too much hate because I say this, but it's just my honest opinion. Arch is an amazing paper, but you kind of have to be kind of experienced to be able to get the most out of it. Like, it's a kind of a sensitive, I don't want to say fragile, I'm not sure the right word, but you gotta know what you're doing. Like, for example, if you are painting something, and for example, you paint the blue for the sky, and you're trying to paint some purple shadow color for the clouds. If you go back and forth multiple times, for example, you're a beginner, you don't know what you're doing, so you have to go and try to fix it, and it would just give you a really muddy effect. The paint looks kind of loses its freshness. So you gotta kind of know what you're doing, not have too many brush strokes. Just the fewer brush strokes, the fresher your watercolor looks on arch paper, or mainly most watercolor papers. And you shouldn't just fiddle, like you shouldn't go back and try to do it, because it's really easy to ruin it. And the paint, it's really easy for the paint to look muddy and dirty basically. So I would not recommend this paper for super beginner artists. If you want to use this paper and you're an absolute beginner, please use the rough surface one. It is easier than the cold press, but that's just what I think. I know a lot of people love this paper. I do love it. I use it all the time. There's nothing against it. But the paper that I wanted to talk about today, that one is so forgiving that it's gonna make the whole thing so much easier for you. Bow hang, I do not have it right now, but it's very similar to Arch. So the texture wise is I tried artist grade bow hang, and it's more textured. The cold press bow hang is more textured than Arch cold press, so it's somewhere between. So bow hang cold press is somewhere between Arch rough surface and cold press. So somewhere in between, that's kind of, the texture looks a little bit different, but it looks really beautiful. And it works really nice too. That's another really good paper if you really like Arch, but you think that Arch is a little bit expensive. Bauhang is very similar to Arch, but it's like cheaper. So, and also Fabriano, I really don't like it as much. It's really hard to, for example, with Bauhang, if you paint something and you let it dry and you try to like re-wet the paper and paint on top of it, the first wash that is already dried is really easy to reactivate. So that's just never been my favorite paper. And also another paper that I wanted to talk about is a Winsor Newton artist grade paper. I tried that one. I think it's not good at all. I think it's kind of similar to like these cheaper sketchbooks that you can find on Amazon. Like I have one here. This is a good one actually, if you don't want to invest too much money on it. Something to just like practice, do some like flowers or like a plant, anything that you just want to save money. I recommend this paper. Of course, it's not cotton paper. You can't do a lot of wet on wet, but it's a really good paper. I think Winsor Newton is very similar to this one, but it's just so much more expensive. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the paper that I wanted to recommend for our beginner artists. So I don't know if you already guessed, but it's a special kind of this brand, a special kind of paper made by this brand that I'm going to talk a little bit more, but it's Saunders watercolor paper. I think this paper stays wet longer than Arch, both cold pressed and rough surface. And what I noticed about Saunders watercolor paper, that is the colors look more vibrant on this paper compared to Arch. I know I might get a lot of hate for saying this, but I have paid close attention to this. And I noticed that because Arch is a very thirsty paper, you usually need to have more water on your brush when you're painting on Arch paper, because the water seeps into the textures of the paper, and that action of seeping into that kind of grays down very slightly. This is not that noticeable, it's kind of subtle, but your colors look less vibrant. This is something that I really noticed, and I don't know if any of you noticed this too. Tell me, leave a comment and let me know, but I definitely noticed something like that. Like I use the same pigments, like I have my palette here, I have same colors, I use the same thing, and it just looks more vibrant on Saunders watercolor paper. Again, I'm not sponsored by this brand at all. This is just my honest opinion, so I don't want anyone to think that I'm like advertising for them, but it's just something that I noticed. And another thing that I really like this paper for is that it's very forgiving. Like for example, if you're a beginner, you're trying to like paint wet on wet, you wet the sky. Of course you're a beginner, you haven't done this 1,000 times, so you kind of slow. Maybe your brush is a little bit too small, so maybe you move on to a bigger brush. This all takes time. Maybe make more paint, add the color. It takes longer for a beginner to even rinse their brushes. Just all this time you kind of slower. And for example, you're painting something, a blue sky, okay, and you're trying to paint some purple color for some shadows on for the clouds. If you have a little bit more water on your brush than the water that is already in the paper, it is really easy to ruin your painting with Arch paper and create backgrounds and muddy effect. But with Saunders, if you have slightly more water on your brush and you just, the paper is already kind of drying and you go back to it, I'm not saying this paper doesn't get ruined. Of course, watercolor is a delicate medium. Watercolor paper is delicate. Like, it's not, I'm not saying that you can go on a paper that is already drying, add a lot of water and it's going to be fine. No, it won't. But compared to other professional grade watercolor papers, this paper is more forgiving. Like, even if you have a little bit more water, even if your timing is off or the paper is already too wet or too dry, it's just overall more forgiving than ours especially, and other papers. So I think this is a very useful thing for beginners to know, because this tiny things can make a huge difference for you. I have had in-person workshops, and some of the students, I noticed how different they like. If you're like more advanced artist, even the pressure that you apply on the paper is different. Sometimes you have more pressure, sometimes you're doing like dry brush, you have less pressure. Like, all these things, beginners don't know these things, okay? If they want to add some shadow color for the trees, they don't know the exact things. But with Saunders, there's more room to make mistakes and you still get a better result, on top of the paper staying wet for longer. So two very important things that can make a huge difference in your learning journey with watercolor. So this is what I wanted to say about Saunders paper, and also the fact that the colors look slightly more vibrant. So this is another very important thing. And the paper that I wanted to recommend is just not this one. Of course, you can have this one too. The same goes with Saunders. It's the same thing. But the one that I really wanted to recommend today is just a piece of Saunders rough surface watercolor paper. This is 300 pounds. So it is kind of a thicker paper, so it doesn't buckle at all. It's really easy to work with. And the way I like to use this paper is to buy the rough surface one, and I like to use the less textured part of it. So this is the higher texture part. Like, you can see all these textures are so rough. They're supposed to be. It's a rough surface paper. But I like to use the back side of this paper because it has less texture. It looks more subtle. It's not as pronounced. But you are also able to have some nice clean edges for like whatever you're painting. If it's like the edges of the river or a mountain or anything you're painting, yeah, you have more control on your brush to have some nice crisp edges if you want it. Also, working wet on wet is unbelievable on this paper. Like, it's so forgiving. It stays wet for so long. Like, if I could recommend just one paper for every artist, but if you're more advanced, you can play around and get other things out of different papers. Like, I still love to use Arch, even though this is a really good paper. I think Arch has a really beautiful texture surface. So I'm not saying all the other papers are bad, but this one stays wet for a very long time. You have a lot more time to paint wet on wet. And if you want to add more color, the color usually sits where you put it. It's hard to explain. The way this paper behaves makes watercolor painting 50% easier for you. Like, overall, like, if you want to think about how long it stays wet, if you want to think about the fact that it's very forgiving and you can go back and forth. For example, you're painting grasses, you didn't get the color right, you mix more color, you add more, it's not going to get muddy, it's not going to look dirty like Arch. Arch starts to look dirty really fast. This one doesn't. And I think that's a really important thing for beginner artists. So I know these papers can be kind of expensive, so what I like to do is to buy like individual sheets. So remember I said I like to use the back side of it because it's less textured. So if you get this is cold press, but if you buy rough surface watercolor block, you're not able to use the back side of it because it's already glued to the block. So you can't really use the back side of it, but that's okay. This is really good too. I'm not saying this is still better than Arch for beginners. Stays wet longer, the colors look better. Everything that I said is true for this one too. But this one, I just love it because I can get it for a little bit cheaper because it's just a sheet. They're not charging me for all this glue and block and everything. And also it doesn't buckle because it is 300 pounds. And you can buy one big sheet of rough surface Saunders watercolor paper on different watercolor shops like Blick or Amazon or where you can find them. For $15 you can get 22 by 30 inches, and you have like a huge big piece of paper, and you can make like, you can get 15 to 20 paintings out of that sheet. Like each painting would cost you less than $1, which is amazing for a really high quality, thick, the best paper I think is out there. So it's not going to cost you as much if you get just a large sheet of paper. And the way I like to cut my papers, I want to show you this too. So I like to like just bend my paper and just try to keep it kind of straight, something like this. And once I see it's kind of, you know, straight like this, I put the pressure over here and it's going to look like this. I think this kind of looks really cool compared to like cutting it using scissors, but that's just a personal choice. It is up to you, whichever you like it. You can get one of those tools that cut your papers straight for you too, of course. But then I do this multiple times, so this becomes really easy to tear. And then I very slowly start basically cutting it like this, tearing it like this. I've got to be very careful, like this. And then cut this one into smaller pieces. And honestly, you can, I think all the beginner artists should paint, all beginners watercolor artists should paint really small. Like the size that I recommend is like this big, because watercolor is really challenging to be able to like master the techniques and all the things that goes through it. And if you have to like, and of course you're kind of slow because you haven't done it a lot of times, but if you have to like fight the size of the paper and like have to, there's no need to work big while you're learning watercolor. The smaller, the easier is control. And then after you understand how to paint wet on dry, how to paint wet on wet, how to soften the edges using a clean damp brush, the charging technique, which is adding color to an already wet surface. Once you learn all that, and if you want to paint big, you just simply purchase a larger brush, like something like this or even larger, and you just simply paint bigger, you know. So try to learn all these techniques on a smaller piece, and you can get like, you can spend about like $15-16 depending on how much for tax, but you can get like 20, even more than that out of that, and just paint it. It doesn't buckle, and it's just a really good paper to use for beginner artists. And I also like to tape it to my table like this, because this paper doesn't buckle at all. So I use the side that has less texture and I turn it around, and I use some of these tapes that I already have ready here. Going to put this one over here, and just this keeps it in place. It's not gonna move. You can paint on it, it's not gonna go around. Another tip that is related to watercolor paper and the painting is if you're painting something completely wet on wet, for example, if this is like a smaller piece of paper, you're painting wet on wet, try to take your watercolor paper and hold it underneath running water, cold water, and just let it be there for about few minutes, not even just a couple of minutes, like 5 to 10 minutes, and just let it become like a paper towel. It should be like soft like this, like completely like a paper towel, and that way you know it's like thoroughly wet. And then you can put it on your table or whatever you're painting on, and that just stays in place. It won't buckle until it's completely dry. And that gives you, oh my gosh, that gives you maybe about an hour until it starts to dry. So you can really take your time, really understand the process. You won't have to rush it. You won't have to like panic and like be scared of the paper drying too fast. That really stays wet for too long. But that's for the times that you're painting wet on wet, and you're painting the sky wet, the land wet, and you want it to stay wet for a long time. So that's another tip that I wanted to share. And just just that's it. Like, invest on buying this paper the same thickness, and you really don't need expensive brushes. You don't need expensive watercolor paints. Honestly, I think you can even learn watercolor with just these cheaper grabby watercolor paints. Of course, they're not as transparent and high quality as a, of course, like Daniel Smith watercolor paint or Winsor Newton watercolor paint or Schminky. Schminky is the best. Of course, they're not as good, but you can definitely learn how to paint with watercolors using these cheaper paints. Of course, it's important what kind of a cheaper paint you're talking about too, because some paints like Winsor Newton, student grade pans, I think I should have them somewhere here. They are cheap, but they're not pigmented at all. Like, you try to get some pigment out of them, it's impossible. I'm not talking about those kind of cheap paints, but something like White Knights is a Russian brand. That's a really good brand. It's very pigmented and budget friendly. Or something like this. This is really good too. It's very pigmented. It's very easy to reactivate. And you also don't need to spend too much money on the brushes either. Like, honestly, you can get really good results just using these Chinese calligraphy brushes. I use this a lot of times. I do have other brushes too, but these are really good brushes. Like this one. These two are the same, from the same set that I found on Amazon, and there was like 10 to 15 different size brushes in this whole set, and I think the whole set was $15, so it's really cheap for one brush. I use this almost every time I paint, so you really don't have to get like more expensive ones while you're learning. Just find a good Chinese calligraphy brush that has good reviews on Amazon. Princeton watercolor brushes are okay too. I have tried some of them that were kind of disappointing for me. I have tried some of the round brushes, and the brushes weren't able to hold their shape. Like, if I was painting something like this, the bristles would stay like this, and then I had to turn it around and it was really terrible. So I don't know why they're so popular, but it doesn't matter. I have this one, the same brand. This one is good, but I'm just trying to say that just find a good, you know, Chinese calligraphy brush on Amazon, and just some paints, maybe White Knights or any other brands that people recommend that are good, cheaper ones. But with this paper, it's going to make the whole thing a completely different for you. Like the whole process of learning with watercolors, it's going to make it for you a completely different experience. So I really hope this video was helpful for you. Please let me know your experience with watercolor papers in the comment section. I would always love to learn and know more about these kind of materials. And yeah, give it a try. Let me know what you think. I really think you'll be surprised. You will notice a huge difference. And yeah, I think that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy painting!